Okay, we're recording. This is the book of Esther. And I just want to start by saying, this is really just for us anyways, that that I love that so many of you are involved in this Bible study because it makes my preaching, I feel like there's this little secret crowd of people that I'm connected to.
Yeah.
And not that some of the information I'm sure other people know, but there is, I mean, like, and as for me, as someone who, I realized I studied all this stuff. I mean, I went to Bible college, and then in my MDiv, I dug deep into these things. But really, for the last decade, I haven't delved too much in the Old Testament, other than like when it's a preaching text. And then, so this has been fun for me too. But it's made surprisingly is as as we've gone through Matthew and now we're going through Mark on Sundays, it really has opened up my own thinking, like, well, what is going on? Where were they coming from? In a way that's been fun too. So hopefully you all find those connections between Sundays and Wednesdays as well here and there. Where are we at? Okay. I love Esther. The book is fantastic. I have had a subtle fascination with it for a long time. And I said last week that I would share with you a little of my own story and I don't know if it'll play, but I do have a video clip that I'll try to show you, and we'll see if it works. But if the internet's not working great, it might be kind of sketchy. But it is on the YouTube channel page where the Bible studies are. And it's only like an 11-minute little clip. And it was like, and I think it was like the opening performance or maybe it was a dress rehearsal. I don't remember what it was, but I found a little clip. We never recorded it, the original one, because back then it wasn't like everyone was recording everything all the time like they do now. But I, in my church in Western Pennsylvania, wrote it ended up being a 40-page, about an hour-long puppet performance around the story of Esther. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I framed the story, and then it'll make sense and it'll give you another context. So basically, it opened up with these little creatures, as like furry, legs and arm sort of creatures, talking to a mother, telling a daughter how why they were celebrating and how they came to be free. And then it jumps into this, and it tells a story of basically this asteroid came from the outer space and sort of crashed into the atmosphere of the Earth. And when it hit the ground, a gas was released that those who were, who couldn't afford to have protection were exposed to these fumes, which then turned them into these furry creatures when a remnant of this thing, and there was a red moon, and I'm not filling in all the details, but it was a whole narrative created around the idea that the world was in a post-apocalyptic environment, and E16142 was the zip code to New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, E for Esther, but that became the almost the concentration camp number, or the group number, or the labeling of a group of people who had been affected by this gas that were called mutants. And within this apocalyptic environment, there was a governor, and he basically sort of ruled the area, and there were districts that people had to live in according to whether you were a mutant or not. And so it tells the story of him, and he fancies one of he calls his queen to come see him, and we'll read about this in a second. And then when she says no, he has her killed, basically. And then Esther ends up becoming the queen. And so the Esther character in this in the story basically has to go through the process. And then you have the Haman character, who's the villain. And if you haven't read Esther a while, we'll go through this and it'll all make sense. But it came to the point where the climax of the show was when, on the night of the full red moon, when Esther character had to reveal who she was to the king or the governor, because she was going to turn into a creature, this furry creature. So it's kind of a mutant werewolf, apocalyptic sort of. Anyway, let me see I'm going to see if I can show you a little clip of it. And if it doesn't work, then we'll just move on, and there will be no love lost. But Hold on, I gotta go here. One second. Let me copy. And there we go. Tell me if you can see the screen. Is it YouTube?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we got it.
Okay, good. All right, I'm gonna open it here. Oops, and that's not what I want to do. I'll go back here. So this was the opening scene. And this is what I was talking about. The puppets, let's see if I can make it full screen. Maybe I can't. It doesn't support full screen in this way. So basically what you see around the screen they were having a banquet. And so there's a black screen and all the kids are wearing black and each of them have these full-bodied puppets. And again, these are junior hires. But the guy in the red there in the middle, that's Mordecai. And the guy to his right with the blondish hair, that's the governor. And then right next to him, you see a guy with an eye patch. And some of you have seen that puppet. That's that character of Haman. And so this is sort of the opening scene where the king is declaring he wants the queen to come see him. And so if you're familiar with the story, if it doesn't for some reason, if you can't hear the sound, let me know. I won't make you watch it if it doesn't show sound. But right now I can see Perry. If you can hear the sound when I hit play, give me a thumbs up. Can you hear any sound?
No.
The screen is white right now. Still a white screen. There's this. No.
It's not gonna. The sound's not gonna play. All right. Well, it's there. It's there for you to watch. It's a little clip of the opening scene. And again, it was an idea that I had for years, and I kind of decided to put the whole youth group was this for a year. So the junior high youth group. So the first half of the year from the fall, we did puppet basics, and we learned about the story of Esther and dug into the story of Esther and read chapters and had an intense Bible study. And then the second, in the spring, we rebuilt the stage and basically put the production together. And the whole thing was being done while I was finishing my dissertation. So I like to think that I had sort of two, it was like my creative output versus my academic output. So, but if you're interested, go to that video and
what's it under, Jay?
If you just go to the YouTube channel that we have that has all the past videos of the Bible study, it's on there. It's on, it's like an 11-minute video. I don't know if the sound doesn't work, let me know. Anyway, all that's to say, I have loved the book of Esther for a long time, and in part because it always fascinated me that it doesn't mention God once. And because of that, it's really been a challenge or an issue of canonicity of whether or not it should be included both in the Jewish canon, but also in the Christian canon. And one of the things, so there are no prayers listed, and then there are no like speeches that sort of declare who God is or connect the narrative to who God is. There's no sacrifices demonstrating that they're really, and given the narrative, there would have been places for that, but there's no sense of like repentance of who they were as an apostate people. There's no mention of Jerusalem or temple or the temple worship. And when you really get down to it, when you look at the characters that we're going to see with Esther and Mordecai in particular representing the Jews, they don't do anything Jewish. They don't seem to have Jewish practices. They don't seem to be living with Jewish traditions. And in fact, in many ways, what you're going to see, and the important thing to sort of consider in the whole thing is neither of them, they're like Jews immersed in Persian culture. They have assimilated into the Persian culture, not being able to completely abandon their identity as Jews. But when you put the story in the context of what we've been learning about in terms of, I said we're taking some of these, now we're going to go back and we're going to stick this in certain spots. So this is going to fall, this narrative that we're going to look at is about 100 years after the first exile, when there already has been a return. And so the years that they kind of place it is during King Azarias's when he was the Persian emperor, during the reign of Azarias, which is a reign during the Persian emperor Xerxes, and it was roughly who reigned between 486 and 465.
Whoa.
So 5th century. So again, we're going back. This is time that we've covered. And again, this is an estimation because you don't know exactly when it falls, but there are things about the story or the book that point to what was happening and why it was happening. So it's said about 100 years after the Babylonian exile. And it takes place in the city of Susa. And I have a picture that I got off. Let me see, where is it? So this one I think is better here. Someone give me yes when you can see it.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So here's Jerusalem over here. And again, there's Jerusalem right there on the dot. And then Susa is over here. So, and what you see in this, the Babylonian Empire, this is the Persian Empire. And you remember when we talked about Cyrus restoring all these, religions of other nations and tribes. This is everything. So when they conquered Babylonia, they conquered this area right through here, which included what we now know as Jerusalem or Israel. But what happened is during this time, when we're looking at the whole idea of when this was after that first wave of Jews went back, and so there was a sense of these were Jews who were left in Persia, in the capital of Persia, and when you look at that whole empire that they conquered, this brings in the absolute amazingness of the story that a Jewish orphan became a queen of Persia. So just pause for a second and just Jews go out, they're exiled from their land, and while they're there, they inhabit that region of Persia, and in the capital of Susa, when the king, later reign after Cyrus was there, then this Jewish orphan who really wasn't practicing Jew, but really still understood herself as being an Israelite, ultimately becomes, through the story that we're going to look at, a Persian queen. And through her courage and through her work and through her effort, ultimately saves the remnant of Jews that remain in Susa at the time. The author is unknown, and it's not necessarily it was designed to be that way, but it's anonymous in that regard, and because of the fact that it doesn't have any of these things that sort of point towards, the question has become: should it be part of an extra canonical sort of category? But they've kept it, and at the end we'll talk about some of the reasons why. Yeah.
In my Catholic Bible, it says that there was 2 forms written, a Hebrew form and a Greek form. And in the Greek, they added 107 verses.
That is true. There's actually 3 forms. So there's 3 editions. The Hebrew edition, which was originally came from what's called, you'll see it some places, it says MT, and it means Masoretic texts. And the Masoretes were the Jewish scholars who who basically cleaned up the texts. The reason Hebrew has the language Hebrew has vowels is because of the Masoretes. So it was preserved with the Masoretic text, the ultimate sort of authoritative version of the Hebrew Bible, and then it was translated by the NRSV, the Bible that our church uses. So we have a direct translation from that Masoretic text for our version of Esther. The second version was the Septuagint, and again, if you remember way back when we talked about the Septuagint, was the Greek translation of the original Hebrew. and it often comes in the symbol of LXX. That is what contains 6 major additions to, how many pages did you say, Jim?
It's at 107 verses.
107 verses, which actually, very interestingly, and I don't have them with me, but add a religious flair to it.
Yeah.
It brings in some sense of who God is. And then the third version was a Greek edition, and it's called the A text, as in the letter A, which ends the entire narrative at chapter 8, verses 17. And they think that actually reflects like the earliest version of Esther. In other words, Esther was passed around in some form of Hebrew and eventually translated, and ultimately, so the original Esther ends at chapter 8:17, which does have not massive implications because there's only 10 chapters, I think, I believe so, in the whole. Now that I say that, I don't know where it ends. 10 or 11, 10, I believe. It only has
10.
Yes, 10 chapters. So, you're getting an end that sort of, and I have a theory about why that is, but we'll look at that. But yeah, so there are several different versions. The version, though, that the Hebrews use in the Hebrew Bible, and the version that we as Protestants typically use, is contained probably as what is in your Bible and what you're looking at. I want to go over the order of it, but I'm going to do that at the end because I think it actually helps sort of frame the whole thing. But a couple of things. Just the book as a whole, we're going to look for things that are ironic. And the entire book sort of operates on this: whatever you would expect to normally happen doesn't. And that's one of the reasons. Like, it is one of the most dramatic role reversal, switcheroo. Like it just, like every point in this book, it seems like every chapter there's like a turn and then another turn, and it's like I think it's one of the most dramatic books. You see it again, a Jewish orphan become a Persian queen. You see, you have Mordecai, who becomes a Jewish leader integrated into the Persian culture, but ultimately he gets elevated to one of the most esteemed positions in the Persian kingdom as a Jew. And them knowing he was a Jew, and in the process saves all of the Jews, or saves many of the Jews that are already living there in Susa at the time. From a Jewish perspective, it has tremendous significance because there are several big Jewish holidays, and we all are aware of Hanukkah because of Adam Sandler's lovely song that comes on the radio all the time. And Hanukkah, I think he also has one for them as well. But there's a third one that kind of stands out, and that's Purim. And we'll talk about Purim, and Purim becomes a pretty significant reminder. And the fact, and we'll go back to this at the end, that Purim is so important to the Jewish culture, and it comes from this book that scholars and rabbis and teachers have wrestled whether or not it should even be in the canon, is a fascinating thing as an educator for me, thinking this book that they wanted to chop out forms a instituted time of celebration for the Jewish people that still reminds them of this story that they didn't even think should be in the Bible to begin with, or in the Torah to begin with. So it's just again, there's just a sort of an irony in all of that. Okay, another thing I want to just point out, that there are, just so you're kind of tracking, how many of you, like if I had to say, how many of you feel reasonably familiar with the story? Raise your hand. Reasonably. Okay. So how many of you just sort of you kind of know a little bit? Okay. I just don't want to. I don't want to start to. I think it's important when you look at the story of Esther to look at it like a screen run, like it's a movie. And so I even wrote in my notes, the very beginning, I wrote cast. I didn't even think about it. I just wrote, this is the cast of, and so because it kind of writes like it's, enter this character, that character, but you have some main characters, and really there are about 5, and though there are some smaller characters that play, but there are 5 main roles. So the 2 main characters are Mordecai, who is a Jew, who is connected to the Persian government and who is elevated throughout the story. And his elevation is actually one of the main themes about it. So he is looked at as being thoughtful but somewhat, just competent, not sly, but calculating and strategic, if you will, but earnest, and still has some sense of identity of who he is. So that's Mordecai. Then you have Esther, and some say it's his cousin, some say it's his niece. I don't know what the relationship is, but it's kind of like in the Filipino families, everyone is my cousin, and they're really not. So I don't know. It could be a cousin or an uncle or a niece or some relationship, but we know that they're connected, or maybe they were just both Jews and they kind of grew up in the same region or family. We don't know, but we know that they were connected. And she is beautiful. And this is both a important fact of the story, as we'll look at, and also a somewhat of a objectifying fact as well. But in this case, what is interesting is her beauty ultimately, and I would even go as to say her beauty and her sexuality, because it really was about this was a sexual arrangement that they were making, and this was a facet of the culture at the time, that because of those characteristics, she is put in a place so that she can actually save everyone. Which it has redeeming qualities and has some problematic qualities as well, and we'll explore those.
Isn't,
Yeah.
I read through it again, and it strikes me that it has almost the flavor of like a fairy tale or a folk tale or something. It doesn't sound quite like reality. It sounds like a fantasy kind of story in some way.
It was cultivated.
Yeah, I don't. It seems kind of like an exaggerated tale.
And honestly, this is the case where I doesn't, for me, maybe it is a tale. Maybe it actually happened exactly as it and in the end of the day, it doesn't really make a difference to me whether it's actual or not. It's what it points to for me, and how it's used as a part of identity formation for Jews, and I guess consequently then also for us. And so for me, I think there's a certain level of this is where God's inspiration has to come into play, because again, I think one of the biggest scandals of biblical interpretation is we assume that that the entire book of the Bible is God dealing with broken people, messing up God's transmission of salvation, love, and redemption to the world. And again, but for some reason, when we espouse that the actual Word of God, the physical Word of God, carries with it some sort of perfection, why do we assume that the book itself tells a story of how God used broken people who kept messing up through the whole process of trying to transmit the gospel, but assume that just in the case of the books that we have chosen, that those are perfect? So for me, there's challenges to the book. That doesn't mean that God is not in the midst of it, in the same way God orchestrated all of this in the midst of human failure. But
isn't
go on.
that the New Testament uses parables all the time?
Exactly.
And so, I mean, couldn't some of the Old Testament stories be kind of like parables too?
Absolutely.
But I think there's a lot of symbolism, tremendous amount of symbolism. And as I was kind of reviewing today, catching up, you have the preceding books, you have Ezra and Nehemiah, and time-wise, they occurred after Esther. And they were born, Ezra and Nehemiah, during that time. The symbolism is what Haman is as pride. You have Mordecai, you have Esther, the symbolism of serving, trusting. And you have the justice of the King Xerxes, where he is led by God to do justice for what Mordecai saved his life. And I think it's an example of obedience, trusting. And as I was struck by reading that Matthew Henry, the guy who wrote commentaries back years ago, said, well, you don't see God mentioned in the book, but you see his finger everywhere. And I think it lends itself to the symbolism of what it means and how it ties together, especially when you think about what Ezra and Nehemiah had to do to restore Israel, where they'd fallen away, and the steps taken with prayer and the word. So that's a
Yes, but
thought.
keep in mind that both with Ezra and Nehemiah, and they were both over in the West rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. And again, just to put that in the sense of your context, this was at the same time that sort of rebuilding of Israel over in Jerusalem was happening. This is farther east in Susa, and this is happening, like these are the leftover remnants of Israel that didn't come back, and how they integrate in. So I agree, Nora, in some sense, in the sense that I wonder if Esther is used more as a teaching book than it is a doctrine book, because, and yeah, we can take it and we can find God in places of it, but really from a Jewish perspective, what's interesting about that is there's nothing redeeming in terms of the actual daily or regular lived out practices of Mordecai and Esther. They're not living as faithful Jews. They're marrying Gentiles. They're integrating into Gentile culture. They have no demonstration that they sacrifice or follow the law or the laws of Moses. So there's a sense that this is one of the tensions, is that they look like it's not meant to be a book to say these are great examples of how to follow God. But what's interesting about this, and I was going to bring this up at the end once we looked at the whole story, but that's what makes it such a powerful book, is because the book demonstrates God's faithfulness to the Jewish people, despite their lack of adherence to the rituals and practices of what was happening in the redeveloped Judaism at that time.
Well, and both, I think Nehemiah, for sure, he was a cup filler before he came back to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And Ezra was there too, wasn't he, in there? So that, and these two were devastated at how much Israel had fallen away. They had intermarried, but
again, this doesn't deal with that part of Israel, though.
No, but it's before that's part of the return to Israel. And even when Nehemiah or Ezra, they return in how they restore Israel, that the importance of the temple and those components that had to be restored, that had fallen away. That's true.
So yes. So this is a book that basically captures that portrait of life. And what we want to look for is some of these divine reversals. And really, the whole book is driven through a series of banquets. You see the banquet, and the amount of times the banquets are mentioned. It's like the whole book is about a big party, which is not surprising that in the development of Purim, you have a 2-day festival in the Jewish tradition that celebrates what's happened in this moment. We'll get to that notion of what Purim is by the end. Hopefully it's almost 6. But no. What I kind of want to do is I kind of want to walk you through, and I'm going to point out the banquets. But the other thing I want to point out, just in terms of our own thinking, is to realize that we're going to start with what's called an exaltation of the king. So like there's these banquets to basically show the Persian king. And again, think about it in terms of part of Israel's back. Some of them will remain. The Persian kings, generally they're good kings. They're not trying to oppress people. Things are going, cultures are going back to what they're going to. He's trying to demonstrate how great he is. So they have this exaltation of who the king is at the very beginning of the book, and at the end of the book, in our version, actually, you have Mordecai's exaltation, or his splendor, or his majesty, and you'll have this lifting up of who he is. In between, if we come in, and I'm going to sort of walk it inward from here, then you have, right after the king's elevation at the beginning, you have Haman's elevation and his edict that he proclaims against the Jews. And then bordering right before that elevation of who Mordecai is at the end, you have Mordecai's elevation or rise to power or rise to his status. And you also have an edict that he's going to put in place. So you have these 2 edicts and 2 opposing characters. One is the antagonist and one is the protagonist. And then within that, you have planning. And in both places, you have, in the very early part of the story, you have Esther and Mordecai's planning to get Esther to be a part of the Persian court, that she's running for queen. Basically, she's throwing herself out there trying to get the role of queen. And then later on, you have Mordecai and Esther's plotting or planning for how they're going to rescue the Jews from the destruction that Haman brought on them. And then you have, in Word More, you have these banquets that border both of them. And right in the middle, you have this place where you have the climax of the whole story. And it's when the red mood comes and the little character turns into a fuzzy creature. Or when Esther has to tell the king that she is in fact a Jew, and the decree that he made with Haman's influence ultimately would cost her life. So just want you to be aware. I'm going to go to the story and it all makes sense, but we're going to go to this pinnacle point in the middle, and then we're going to see a reversal or unpacking of the same pattern of the narrative. And again, going back to what Glenda said, this is a curated story in terms of it's meant to sort of flow in a certain way. Were you going to say something else, Glenda?
No, not right now. I mean, there some things about the story really bother me, like the role of women in this story is
We'll get to that. We're going to talk about that.
disgusting. And then they kill that Feast of Purim is basically a celebration of killing 75,000 people. So
Of the Persians.
of the Persians, that's
Yeah.
right, by the Jews.
Well, there's but that goes back into a lot of it. I mean, what is Passover?
Yeah.
Isn't that worse? That's killing of babies.
Yeah.
That didn't do anything.
It feels almost like people were just more primitive or savage or something.
Oh, absolutely. But I don't think we have to accept that this is a part of the evolution of humanity. And this, and you could see why God was so mad, because we're thinking like what on earth? What's wrong with these people? But we're looking back, and we also have the Holy Spirit. So we won't judge them too harshly. Okay, well, let's dive into it. I'm going to kind of walk you through, and just sort of like about 10 minutes, I want to walk you through the story, and this will and I'm going to do a summary kind of it, and that doesn't mean I'm going to hit on every narrative piece, but I'm going to sort of give you just a movement through it so you get a sense of what happened. And if you have your Bible with you, and look at the little breakdowns, I can kind of point to a few places, and I'll read a few scriptures along the way. So the what's that?
Look at it.
So the book starts with basically timing it, and they happen in the days of Azarias, the same Azarias who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, demonstrating the Persian Empire. And it goes on and sort of gives some instruction of who he was and what's happening. And you see that in later on verse 5 and 6, there were basically, you have the idea the king gave for all people, the president of the citadel in Susa, both great and small, a banquet lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So the king just wants to say, hey, look at how great our empire is. And it's not just for the rich, it's for everybody. It's like there's a general and genuine sense, like you can't not like the king of Persia. As far as kings go that were conquering stuff, he's pretty good in my book. But drinks were big, and it goes on and it tells you how it sort of happens. And then you have in the middle, and still in chapter 1, you have this call where he wants his king Vashti to come to his chamber, to be before the entourage, or be before the party, and she doesn't want to come. She's like, no. And he's like, okay, well, if you don't want to come, then you're no longer the queen. And he orders her death, essentially, is what happens. And it puts it I guess it puts it kind of straightforward. And then out of this, so Vashti dies, and there's a decree that basically men are to be the masters of their own home, and it sort of sets up this reinforced patriarchy. We're not, there can be no disobedience by women in this scenario. And establishes the sort of this, and then this, and that in and of itself has all sorts of problems that we could dig into. and we could spend the next hour or so talking just about this introductory fact, but I don't want you to get tripped up in it, because the fact that the queen was disposed is what makes the whole story happen. So just hold that, like there's nothing likable about anything that happens in that first chapter. But it happened, and that was the culture that it was in. And honestly, it really shouldn't surprise us as we've looked through just the how people interacted in the nature of the relationships between men and women. And again, this goes back to the fact that I just want to throw out again. I was talking to someone else about this. This is one of, look at the curse that you find in Genesis. Increase childbearing worth, and your desire will be for the man, and he will rule over you. Like part of this, and I don't, we could dig into this for several days, but the idea that Eve was the one who initiated the apple, there was that sense of the sort of like, and again, it was written by the Bible was written by men, but she's the one who gave it to Adam and drew him into that as well. So she was the first to eat, Adam was the second to eat. And so that sense of your rule, and from a purely feminist or maybe an ultra feminist perspective, really, of the story of the creation, Eve was actually set up as the more dominant character and as the power. And the idea was thought that at times that then that reversal was sort of stripped. Now, I don't buy into that personally. I think that the desire that Eve had was for God, and the desire that Adam had was for God, and the desire between them was purely just relational in terms of what it was, and that the desire then for God was just sort of was necessarily well, quite frankly, I think it's that enters sexuality into the world. We'll get into that another day, but I think our concept of modern day or our Western understanding of our human understanding of sexuality didn't enter the world until the fall. Yeah, Jim. Now I've got off track.
I thought it was interesting. In my Bible, there's a prologue, and it's the dream of Mordecai.
Oh, it probably is drawn from those original verses.
Yeah, and it just kind of goes through a destruction and dragons and all these things.
And again, this goes back to what Nora was saying, is what the point of the book. You're saying Nora's lifting up the virtues of some of these people. There is a teaching role of this book. And when it's grouped again with Ezra and Nehemiah and Chronicles that were sort of summaries, and this was all sort of compiled around the time that Israel was being reestablished in Jerusalem, we got to take into consideration what these sacred texts, how they functioned in the life of those communities as they were being reestablished. And so from someone who was, when came back from the exile and was living in Jerusalem and reestablished as a Jew or as Israelite in the Promised Land, what would their vision or view be of these Jews who remained in Persia, who didn't come back with them? These are the ones who stayed and assimilated into the culture. Well, the message to them would have been that God still is caring and faithful to all of the ethnic adaptations, despite their unfaithfulness, which is kind of the larger picture of the larger teaching part of the book. So there's a beauty contest, basically, and you see this in 2:1. After these things, when the anger of the king Cyrus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed against her. And then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let the beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint." It's doing a little bit of a swagger just so it sounds kind of creepy. "And let the king's servants who attended him be saying, let the beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appointed commissioners in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in the citadel of Susa under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch." And he was only a eunuch because if he was going to be around all these beautiful women, the king didn't want any sort of pilfering on the side. Who's in charge of the women. Let their cosmetic treatments be given to them. Let the girls who please the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. So again, this goes back to, and this is one of those point of tensions, The only reason that Esther made it to where she was is because she was beautiful and she was being sold off for the purposes of, you know, I dare I say love, of sexual relations. So let's pause there for a second. How's that sit with everyone?
Not too well.
And again, this could be full story truth. It could be constructed in some ways. But as the story goes, he fancied her. He thought she was beautiful. She became the queen. And then you have this. You go on and it gives you for the remainder of 2, just sort of the where is it? Where is it? I had a passage I was going to read to you. I didn't mark it though. Well, 2 sort of ends with Mordecai discovers a plot, and this is an interesting thing. So it goes through the celebration of who she was and a little bit of the background. But it goes in chapter 2 ends with Mordecai discovering the plot, a plot that the king was going to be killed. And he says he was sitting at the gate, and then actually, if you watch the I believe that's the little clip there. If you watch on the video that I put up on the YouTube page, that scene is there as well. But he got knowledge that there was going to be an assassination plot on the king. And then in chapter 3, you have this, and then Mordecai tells Esther, and then Esther tells the king, and then Mordecai is meant to be honored, but it didn't happen. In chapter 3, you have the introduction of Haman, the character, the Agagite, from which are a group of people who descended from the Canaanites, which again, giving you, remember that earlier connection that the Canaanites were the ones that they had to cross over into Canaan across the Jordan when they first went over when they were first crossing over into the promised land. And the strict instructions were not to be like the Canaanites. The Canaanites have always been sort of the evil folk of the story. And in the midst of this, then you have the beginning. You have in chapter 3, you have the king promoting Haman, and Haman ultimately makes a decree that says everyone who doesn't bow to him is going to get in trouble. And when he sees Mordecai, and he knows he's a Jew, and Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman, Haman gets angry and goes to the king and basically just develops a plot against Mordecai, and casts. And this is where the idea of Purim comes. To the pur is the word for a die, a casting of the die. And so Haman basically plots against Mordecai and all of the Jews by basically saying, I'm gonna cast this die, figure out a date, and the date was set for the 13th of Adar. And that date, all of the Jews that were left over from the remnants of when they were occupied in the Babylonian territory, when the Persian Empire came, and then again they went back, those who remained would be put to death. And this is a major sort of this is that the tension is rising in the story. And then the plan at this point, and you see that in 4, you see that in chapter 4, and in particular, one of the more notable verses that comes out of this is 4:13 and 14. It says, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think that the king's palace you escape any more than any other Jews, for if you keep silent at such a time as this, and again, if you've been in the church for any part of your life, I'm sure you've heard that phrase, such a time as this. It's the most quoted verse from Esther, but that's where it comes from. Relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but if you and your father's family will perish, who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Again, there it is. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go and gather the Jews to be found. And then basically she goes on to say, if she, at the end of that, after that, I'll go to the king, though it is against the law. If I perish, I perish. In other words, if I die, I die. And what's interesting about this is there is a confession of Mordecai, even if you don't do this, even if you don't reveal your identity and try to intersect to this, God's going to, it doesn't say God, but it says relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your family, you and your father's family will perish. In other words, you're going to die because, they're going to discover who you are, but some way God is going to save everyone, save the Jews. So that becomes sort of the most prominent part of chapter 4, and really one of the books, that notion of such a time as this, that God is using and moving in ways that we aren't even aware. So in 4, you see the plan to have Esther reveal her identity, and Mordecai throws out these verses again of that providence. In 5, you have the beginning of the banquets that Esther throws, and ultimately she throws 2 banquets for the king, because she's not just allowed to approach the king. So she threw a banquet for him, and Haman was invited to that, and Esther was, not, I don't, in the sense of the Haman gets drunk, and the king is entertained, and Haman's honored, and then Haman leaves, and he sees Mordecai, and he's reminded of how angry he is at Mordecai, and the fact that, and you see this in the sort of middle part of 5 or the end of 5, and there's a sense that he won't bow to him, so he has this what's it called, like a post erected to basically impale Mordecai on, and he plans to kill him. But so then you have a second round of a dinner party, but in between those two, you have this chapter 6, which brings this sort of thing. We're right almost at the climax, and in the story you have this plot against the Jews. Now you have it intensified, and Mordecai is going to be put on a stake. You have Esther, who's just had this banquet, and she's trying to tell the king her identity, but she's not able to, and she's going to have to do another one. And the night in between these two, the king can't sleep. He's restless. And what does he do? He doesn't log on to Netflix and watch some stupid show like I do sometimes in the middle of the night. He asks for the records to be brought to him, to be read to him, so that he's bored, and he goes to sleep, which I think is just a fantastic use of humor in scripture, because that's funny. He's like, hey, I'm bored, I can't sleep, I'm restless, what's going, like bring me the records. And in the midst, and this is like the divine irony again, in the midst of him not sleeping and listening to these divine records, he is reminded that this guy Mordecai, that's in his governmental structure, who ultimately was the one who saved him from being assassinated by these two gentlemen, or not gentlemen, scumbags, a few chapters earlier. He realizes that he's never honored Mordecai, and he realizes, that needs to happen. So the second banquet comes around, and then during this, you have the revelation of who Esther is, and you have the revelation by Esther of Haman's plans to kill all the Jews. And now you have this moment of just the pinnacle of the book, where the king is in this moral conflict. What on earth? You've just tricked me, Haman. Now I have to kill my beautiful bride who I love. And then they send, where are we at? And we're in 7 now. I'm sort of getting caught up in the story just in general. Then Haman leaves, and this is that demise of Haman, where all of a sudden you see the reverse. In the middle of that, sorry, I got ahead of myself. There's this moment where when the king realizes that he didn't honor Haman, and Haman comes in and he's saying, what would you do to honor a man who's done great things for you? And the king thinks that Haman is talking about Mordecai, but Haman's talking about himself. And so basically and the king's like, what would you do to honor this man? And Mordecai says, I'd give him a parade and send him out and parade him in front of the town and sing his praises. And then he says, well, then you're going to do that for Mordecai. And so there's this reversal again of this Haman thinking he's going to have this moment where he's glorified and the king's going to honor him, but instead he has to bring this to Mordecai. So then let's jump back ahead. So the king's angry. He finds all this stuff out. Mordecai ultimately gets thrown on the impalement spike. and is in there and for everyone to see. And then around this chapter is where we get the break from the original, or from the version, the shorter version. But there's a discovery that they can't reverse the decree. It goes against Persian law, I guess. They can't reverse a decree that was put out. So they come up, and this is where Haman comes in, a second degree. And the second degree was that anyone who's plotted against a Jew, that Jews have the right to defend themselves and to enact sort of violence upon them. So it unleashes sort of, it gives us this sort of grassroots, marginalized group within Susa empowerment to attack anyone who is plotting to kill or hurt them, which means all of Haman's and all of his officials and all of his whole family and his unit. They all end up dying. And then at the end, Mordecai is elevated, and then and everyone's destroyed, and then there's this 2-day banquet at the end, which is where the Jews get their sort of framework for Purim. And again, Purim is that whole story of this notion of redemption and so then the question that we're left with is, why would Jews want to use Purim to remind their Jews that went back to perceivably to Jerusalem to establish themselves as a people? Why would they want the story of exiles in Persia in the midst of a portion of the canon that is meant for teaching? And the last few things that I'll just say, just to kind of point you to, is not only that the book is filled with coincidences and irony, it's got all sorts of moral ambiguity. Like Nora said, there are good things about them, that they're courageous. There are human traits that are admirable about them, but there are also things in terms of Judaism that are not helpful. That the idea that human action matters is an important theme, because God is not a divine player. We see God's fingerprints. I like that imagery, but God is not an actor in this story. Humans are making strategic decisions, and God is using those decisions. And again, this is a cultivated story to basically demonstrate that his faithfulness and love was for all the Jews, even those who were in exile still, or who were the diaspora remaining out there. And so God still redeems, and God's faithful. But to legitimate human actions and agents in the story. All right, I'll stop there.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm getting the feeling that you're saying that that the king was only going to kill the people in Susa. Wasn't he going to kill the people in Israel too?
Well, Jews in general. How far that, I don't remember to be honest with you, how far that edict extended.
Well, there was 127 provinces.
Yeah, but that's a pretty big region, though.
It didn't extend clear over to Israel?
I would have to read that a little closer for I wasn't paying attention to the boundaries of the edict.
I always thought that he was going to kill all the Jews.
Let me see here. Letters were sent by couriers to the king's provinces, giving orders to destroy, kill, and annihilate all Jews, young, old, women, children, one day, the 13th and 12th month, which is the month of Adar, to plunder the goods. So I guess it would be, were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces. So conceivably, yes, giving orders to kill and annihilate. So yes, it would extend. I don't know.
I mean, that makes me feel that God was really interested in preserving the Jewish people, and that, maybe this thing that he couldn't sleep and all this stuff God was behind all this.
Oh, I have no doubt that God was behind all of this, and that God was a silent player in this. I mean, I think God was, and God could have been an active player in it, but the story does not reveal that activity.
Right, but you can get that feeling, and I guess I feel like that's what's happening with us in our world now. We don't see God actually working in it like he did with the Hebrews, but I think he's behind a lot of everything that's going on, and that's our hope, is that God is using history, he's using people, he's using everything like he did in this story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think God's in the background of everything. I mean, we all have it pretty good. I mean, us in the Western world with, we all have provisions. We're not suffering. We're warm at night. I mean, when you think about the fact that the Jews were, everything they went through and they were exiled, I mean, they were, and you think that these were God's chosen people. And so, yeah, I mean, absolutely, God is in the midst of this story in the sense of saving the Jews. But the fact that God is not mentioned, and the fact that this book has become part of both the Christian and Jewish canon, despite the fact that God is not mentioned, in the fact that it has this character of a cultivated, one commentary called it a novella. It's like a short novel of a story. And so for me, as someone who thinks about things in terms of Christian education and how we're formed by them, the question comes is how were Jews meant to be formed by this book?
Or what it
Somewhere
meant to
that,
be a Jew, what it
Yeah.
meant to be a Jew, or what this also reminded me of with Haman wanting to destroy all the Jews. It's like, and there's the other symbol in being so full of yourself I was reading in a devotional, there's a second sin to breaking the 10 commandments, or like the covetousness or your interest in yourself, me tooism, that precedes all the other parts of that 10 commandments. But what does it mean to be a Jew and save his people? Or right at the beginning where you're saying the king was proud, or he was wanting to boast about have these banquets, and Vashti, who she was being unsubmissive. And that's where it was saying that he had to set an example for her, and that to me sets an example. Submit to one another, that you're showing an example. But in my other last thought is that when I was introduced to this book, it had to do with Mordecai going to Esther, and she had to be humble and submit to what he was asking her to do, the risk of it. And that was an example of servanthood, to serve. And so that you wanted to protect what being a Jew meant, God's chosen people. And although they had backslidden, or they were falling short of that, intermingling, etc. But I mean, that's the neat, exciting tale. And it's a tale for today too. When they went back to rebuild Jerusalem, they had to first build the temple and have a right heart attitude with that. And then concurrent with that, they had to have the wall of protection. And how Nehemiah, Nehemiah is one of my favorite books, of what he did and his humble servant attitude at prayer, and Ezra with the significance of God's word, how that just speaking that word convicted people. So anyway, I think it's interesting, all three. I guess that's obvious.
Yeah. Donna, what were you going to say?
I wanted to go to the idea of the Purim, that it seems like the whole story was to tell why they celebrated Purim.
Yes, but then the question becomes, and maybe this is left us somewhat up to some interpretation, but what is the purpose then of celebrating Purim? I mean, in terms of, again, why do you look at a book that deals with the exiles that didn't come back and fully integrated into the life of Persia to the extent that they're now Persian royalty?
But Jason, I just have a question.
Yeah.
When they came back and rebuilt the temple and the wall in Jerusalem, this all happened before they did that. In Esther, it happened before.
Yes, but the first group already went back.
And then that's what prompted Ezra and especially Nehemiah to go back. Both of them were very disappointed on what was going on.
But that was what was going on. Well, that was what was going on back in Jerusalem.
But wasn't,
This is again, you got just for the sense of size. Where's my photos? I'll show you the other one that I had. This is the second map I think was helpful. Here's Israel's over here. This is Jerusalem.
mhm.
You know, Susa is over here. Like
But
all those Jews came back.
them.
This is dealing with the remnant that were left in. This is dealing with the remnant that didn't deny their Judaism or their ethnicity, but were not living by the laws of Moses or any sense of temple worship.
But it took, they said, was one of the prophets said it would take, or 70, they were sent away 70 years to go
Into
with
Babylonian exile, yes. And then they were
Yeah.
sent back after the 70 years. And then 30 years after that, this is when this is happening. So probably sometime, and I don't remember the exact time frame, but sometime between Zerubbabel going back and establishing the tabernacle and Ezra being sent back to bring the law. But the point being is, this is not a book that is for those Jews who went back. This is a story of the Jews who remained in exile Persia. And so the question becomes, what does that tell us?
Look at chapter 9, verse 20. And this is where it says, Mordecai recorded these events and sent the letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month. And it seems to me that Mordecai sort of established this celebration of Purim. It goes on, he wrote to them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. And this is what the Jews are still doing, right?
It is, yeah. Sometimes it's a movable holiday, but sometimes it falls in February, sometimes in March.
But go back a few verses, Donna. On the 13th day of Adar, the Jews in the provinces had come together to defend themselves. They killed 75,000 of their enemies, but the Jews did not take anything that belonged to the ones they killed. So, points for that. And then on the 15th day of the month, the Jews in Susa held a holiday and celebrated after killing their enemies. So what's this feast all about? It's about to celebrate that they killed 75,000 people. Did God want them to do?
Well, sure, it wasn't love, but they were going to kill every Jew there was. We celebrate at the end of a war too.
Well,
I mean, I don't
there's
think
the
it can
argument
be
for
that
self-defense.
I think they're celebrating Jewish nationalism more than that they're celebrating, that God protected them or anything.
You mean present day Purim celebrations?
Well, maybe, but the original one especially.
Well, I don't know if you would. I think Jewish nationalism is a little bit of a modern day context put on over it. I mean, the reality is that if someone said all Americans were going to die by an edict, and somehow we survived that, even to the extent of battling, I think that we probably would establish a holiday in honor of our salvation as well. In other words, I don't think it was, whether and the delivery part and the notion of that delivery is interesting, just because that's where, in my opinion, that's where you see God the most sort of shine through, in that broader notion of just the idea that the Israelites were delivered or were saved. I don't think that the actual actors or the characters in it were denying God's existence or were apostate or backsliders, or I just think that again, Judaism was a sloppy identity. That's why Ezra and Nehemiah and, that's why you have a constant return to reestablishing. That's why you have a constant retelling of this story. And that's why Purim, as one of those places where the whole redemptive story, and in particular this one, is shared. It's not just this story, the whole redemptive story. There's always, you see this throughout Chronicles and in Ezra and Nehemiah, you see this retelling in these little vignettes of the whole story of God's redemptive process. And again, that's because the Jews are bound to this idea that God has been faithful to them, even though they have not been faithful to him.
And I have
It's a great, yeah, go on.
commentary on it says on verse 8 or chapter 8:17 is a question of what it means to be Jewish. And the bottom line point of it is it's in a story in which Jewish identity was taken far from obvious. That's because they had fallen away. So what it meant to be Jewish in the fullest sense of being devout servants, separate, but they were resurrecting that possibly because that's why the feast of that might be to establish, advocate for what it means to be Jewish. God's people serve him.
And again, I'd argue that at this point, the Jewish identity in those Persian Jews was probably pretty weak. That's the whole reason Ezra exists, because the Jews that did return needed to be retaught what it meant to be Jewish. And again, they didn't have didn't have the Bibles and the Torahs in their houses to be sharing. So it was everything was shared by faith by passing that down from one descendant or generation to the next. So when so again, I guess what I hope that you leave from this book, and honestly, if of the books that we will look at and explore over, and that we have and that we have yet to explore, I think Esther is definitely one that is worth reading. Just because it's 10 chapters, you can read it in an hour and sort of dig around in it. You can see the irony of the story. It's just it is a charming gem. And despite the fact that there's a lot of people who died, but honestly, by this point in the story, like, that's nothing new. I mean, the amount of people who were killed, but the Israelites going, and the amount of battles that were done in God's name, and that's why, really, when you take seriously the stories of the Old Testament, they really do challenge our modern day understanding of the all-loving, compassionate, never wanting anything bad to happen God. That's not the God that is portrayed in Scripture. That's a facet of who God is in Scripture, but God has other facets as well.
I know that you don't want us to take these characters as examples or role models or moral kind of models, and I agree with that. But it does seem as though the characters here, because this is such a kind of a drama, as you say, it's set up almost like a stage play. Just the character types are interesting in that Xerxes is this king, and he's well-meaning, but he's so naive. He's so easily swayed. Haman comes and says, "Oh, you got to kill all the Jews." He says, "Okay, here's my ring. Go, make an order." And then Mordecai comes and says, "Oh, but there's this plot against you." And then he's so easily swayed. And then Esther comes and says, "Come to a banquet," and he says, "I'll give you half my kingdom." He's such a kind of shallow character.
Kind of a buffoon. Yeah. I mean,
exactly.
he's definitely kind of a goofy,
Right.
I mean,
he'll give her half his kingdom, and he's just so
and
odd.
he kills his queen because she wouldn't come when he was calling. Like, he seems rather, he's not a lovable character.
No.
But again, like the setup, the nature of the king's personality, the disposition he carries, is such a major part of the story.
Right.
If he was decisive, if he was rational, if he was thoughtful, if he had, then none of these things would have ever happened. So again, when you think about a curated story, the question becomes, why does this story exist in our canon? And
who are the admirable characters here? Not Haman and not Xerxes.
Well, Mordecai and Esther would be the only. I mean, you kind of have compassion for the king and you like him because he's not doing anything,
Right. He's kind of, I don't know, naive, and he's
Can I say something?
out of his steps. He shouldn't be.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, Mordecai and Esther are both guided by at least unselfish principles.
Yeah.
And they're willing to risk themselves They're not in it for themselves and their own image and their own pride or status. And so I think there is that principle that if if you're guided by a self-interest,
Yep.
a kind of,
But again, do you want to take scripture and make an object lesson out of it for the improvement of moral character in
No,
our present day?
I don't want to look at it that way, but I think it is kind of a underlying principle of how God wants us to live.
Yes.
That if you live for self, your life isn't going to go well.
Yeah.
You-
And they sacrificed.
Right. And if you live for more altruistic motives, then God does bless that.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a theme throughout all of the scripture. I mean, that's not just in the book of Esther. Again, going back to when you disobey God, curses will come and bad stuff's going to come. When you obey God, good blessings will come. I mean, this is the theme through all of it. And, there's a faithfulness there and blessings come and God saves, the Jews. But what is for certain is that it was a major turning point, and maybe maybe in the end of the day, and again, I would encourage you to read this, but maybe at the end of the day, the reason this is, and this is just sort of me throwing my opinion in there, the reason this is in the Jewish canon is to remind Jews that God is faithful regardless, but sometimes this is also a story of a reminder of, and I was just thinking about that, if Donna, if what you're saying is true, that this is, if it was all of the Persian Empire and all of the Jews if they were all threatened to be eliminated, then it would have been obviously mass genocide. And maybe it's to remind those Jews that returned to Jerusalem that something was happening in Persia or in Susa that could have eliminated them, but that God was present, even though God's not mentioned. Again, that's the divine irony of the book as a whole. You expect God to be a major player, but he's not. I'm mindful of the time. If there's any burning thing that has to be said, now's the time to say it. Otherwise, we're going to shut this baby down. All right.
But I've been bothered by a question from last week. During that time that the temple was destroyed and the ark and everything was not there, where was God during that time? Because he dwelt in that temple. That his presence was there. So where was his presence when the temple was destroyed?
That's a good
He'd already
question.
left.
He might have already left, took off. I mean, and there's a sense of what's in church history called modalism, in the sense that God sort of embodies God is everywhere. So although when you say the presence of God was in the temple, it didn't mean all of God was necessarily in the ark in the temple and that God was nowhere else. But remember when the Babylonians raided and they took the Ark of the Covenant and they moved it around from different city to different city and bad stuff was happening. So clearly God's spirit was still dwelling in that vessel to some extent, because they were like, yeah, this isn't working, let's send it back. But I don't think that necessarily means that even so maybe part of God's spirit dwelled in the ark, but I think that doesn't negate the fact that God was also everywhere. So
Okay.
All right. It was good studying with you. Next week, we get into another sort of similar book, Job, in the sense of it has questions of whether or not, this is this contrast to Esther. This is a lot of dialogue between Job and God and the devil, and a lot of our understanding of Satan and who he is comes from this narrative. And I got to tell you, if you think you've been tested thus far about your view and who God is, I don't think there's, Job is going to push us a little bit further, because it is a fantastic story with a great ending, but in the middle of it, it's kind of awful. And you think, like, is this the God we confess him to be? So it is a longer book. It's got a lot of back and forth. I would suggest, if you want to look at it, skim through it. But if you're going to take the time to read one of them right now, jump back into Esther. I think it'd really be worthwhile to kind of looking at that and pondering that, not only in terms of what, and again, the question I want you to wrestle with is not just why the book is there for Jews, which I think we could probably piece together some construction of why that might be. But I think why that book and how that book functions beyond our object lesson character development sort of emphasis on it. Why would that book be important for us as Christians? I don't necessarily have an answer for that, but it's something to wrestle with, because it's a great book, and it reveals a lot about both Judaism and about the place that the book has within Christianity. So, all right. Peace
See
be
ya.
with you.
Bye.
Stay warm.
Bye.
Always interesting.
God bless.
Good luck on your
You
second
too, everyone.
shots.
Be well.
Like your haircut.
Oh, to me?
Yes,
Or- oh, thanks. Yeah, I trimmed up.
yep, I like that.
Shannon, I tried just to take a little off, and then it got more and more, and then I just was like, I had to bring it back down to a, because I can do it myself. So,
You did a good job.
well, thanks.
Bye.
All right. We'll
Bye.
catch you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.